Thank you so much. Thanks, Antigone and Jesse Susanna, for holding the space with me. And thank you to all the organizers and the incredible weavers of the Confluence. It's really, really sweet to be here. And thank you to all of you for coming here to spend this Sunday afternoon with me. It's really so sweet to see all your faces. And I've been feeling you coming as I've been preparing for this workshop, just like in prayer. And it's sweet to just land here and be with you all. I want to begin our time together by naming that I am here, beaming from unceded Pecumtuck, Nipmuc, Nonotuck territory, and that it is my prayer that for those of us who are not native to Turtle Island, that this work that we're doing really be in service to honoring the ancestors and elders and treaties of these ancestral homelands, and that we commit to practices of reparations and native land sovereignty. And it's so beautiful to also see in the chat all the places that you are coming from. So I want to first just invite us all to ground here together in, like, let's just start with a protection practice together. This practice is traditionally done before bed as a sort of guardian practice, as part of like bedtime rituals for thousands of years, and has kind of been readapted. And it's the practice of inviting or invoking archangels, which are really just messengers or a kind of like divine energy to surround ourselves with. And there's a specific practice of calling the specific angels for their qualities to the four sides of our bodies. And then at the end to sort of call in what we call Shekhinah, which is just kind of like an indwelling presence, this sort of like local neighborhood divine energy to be with us. So we're gonna do that together and then dive into the information. So you're welcome to close your eyes or not, as whatever is comfortable for you. So we're going to use these directional prompts to sort of surround ourselves with who and what we need for a sense of connection and protection right now. So bringing in to your right side, calling in someone or something. This could be a plant, an ancestor, a friend, an animal. Calling in an energy that brings wonder and awe, and feeling that presence at your right. And then on your left, inviting in a quality of strength, someone or something that really brings a feeling of strength to you. And inviting in front of you, someone or something that brings a sense of shining, of radiance, of light in front of you. And then inviting an energy, a spirit, an ally at your back that brings a sense of protection, healing, and remedy. And feeling these four energies around you, encircling you, just inviting in a divine presence, which also is your own divine presence, and just sort of saturating yourself with your own presence, filling yourself up with that kind of divinity feeling all around you. And just letting yourself lean into that, breathe into that, and just feel it around you. And if you've closed your eyes, you can take a breath and open them. And that practice, which is based on the practice of calling in the archangels, was adapted by my friend Cole Kravitz, who lives in Ohlone land. So when I was little, I grew up with my great-grandmother, Frances Zipporah Diamond. And whenever she met someone for the first time, she would ask them, who are your people? That was how she got to know people. Who are your people? And I could answer that in many ways. There's many people who are my people, but ancestrally, my people are Jews from Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, the Balkans, and the Mediterranean and Iberian Peninsula. I count my mother and my grandmothers and my great-grandmothers as my primary teachers. And I'm also grateful to be in a web of other Jews and witches and healers and dreamers in healing justice and disability justice work who I learn from and alongside of. I want to name, as we're going to dive into some of this rich, really rich lineage of protection magic, that being in a space learning about Jewish tradition can be really beautiful and really nourishing for so many of us, and can also be really provocative and challenging. I know, without even knowing all of you, that in any space like this, there's a wide range of knowledge and experience, and that some of you may or may not be Jewish. Some of you may have different relationships and feelings about your Jewishness or not Jewishness. And that, you know, there are ways in which the history of, like, in Jewish education, that some of these things we haven't had access to. And so I really want this to feel like an accessible space. So in the handout, which will be shared with you, Jessie Sue will also be pulling some of these words. I'm going to use some words that may or may not be familiar to you. And there are definitions in the back of the handout that I've provided. And also it's like, it is part of Jewish tradition to ask questions. It's like part of our sacred practice of learning is like a million questions, and that there's no one right answer. And so your questions are really welcome. Your curiosity is really welcome. And I just want to invite all of us to release any feelings of shame or concern or worry or fears of like not knowing enough or not being Jewish enough, or whatever comes up and arises. That's all welcome here. Everyone is welcome here. And just know that like whatever comes up for you is probably coming up for at least one other person in this space in terms of relationship to some of this information. So when I was invited to present at this conference and I learned that the theme was intuition, the first thing that came to mind for me was that I wanted to teach about protection magic. Because for me, like having a sense of protection and holding is vital for me to feel like I can stay connected to and deepen into my intuition. And I think for those of us who've experienced any kind of trauma, it can be really confusing and tricky to discern between what is our intuition and what is a voice of fear, or what is hypervigilance. And so much of our intuition is, we're trained, for those of us who've experienced trauma, that like is a training for us. So I have found when I bring my attention and my focus to practices of protection, which is where my attention wants to be anyway, that other things can flow more easily, that my intuition can flow more easily. So when I create a strong container and that's where I put my energy and focus, it's almost like breath. Intuition becomes like breath. So we're going to dive into some protection practices in service to strengthening our intuition, in service to all the intuition practices that you've been filling yourself up with in this whole confluence. And for me, my protection practices are all rooted in Jewish magic, which is rich with practices and rituals and remedies for protection. I want to say that I really believe that reconnecting with our ancestral traditions is healing and liberatory and can be an act of resistance. For one, when we root into practices from our own lineage, it's a way of divesting from cultural appropriation. It offers us an opportunity also to divest from harmful practices and mechanisms of protection, because we're actually drawing on practices that are about connection and interdependence, which are inherently life-affirming. And for those of us who live in the US and are experiencing mainstream American, Western, white supremacy culture, which that purports to establish not protection, but safety and security, which is really different, through harmful means, through policing, through borders, through militarism, through practices based in xenophobia and settler colonialism. And as we know, in reality, those practices do not build protection, do not build safety, do not build security. They actually encourage enormous insecurity and are violent and unsustainable for the earth, and are dangerous and life-threatening, especially for Black and Brown people, for Indigenous people, for poor and disabled people, and for trans and gender nonconforming people. So we can also remember that there have been times in human history where people actually built a sense of protection and rootedness through connection to each other, through connection to ancestral stories, through connection to the elements, to plants, to stones, to celestial bodies, and to spirit and divinity. So we're gonna think about those things and root into those things. And know that when we root into those, when we reconnect with those traditions, that we're in a practice of de-assimilation. And that also is an act of resistance. And I think that by connecting with these things, there's a way, to me, it feels like it can be resistance against late stage capitalism and internalized capitalism, because I think what we're doing here is cultivating a sense of intimacy and connection with these practices. And by being in interdependence, by being in relationship, we sort of undo the spell of capitalism and materialism. So, and I really want to stress that as we talk about these practices and these remedies, that the magic and power is not in the thing, right? It's not in the thing. It's not in the amulet. It's in the relationship to the amulet. It's not in the practice itself. It's in our relationship to the practice. And that also really, what's beautiful about that is that it supports this way that it's very integrated in Jewish practice, not counter to Jewish practice, because if the power is in the relationship, and the power is in relationship kind of to ourselves and to divinity, we're not actually participating in what mainstream Judaism is concerned about, which is like idol worship, or, you know, all these different ways. And we're going to talk a little bit about that there have been times where there's been a little bit of debate about these practices, if they are prohibited or permitted. So Judaism has always had elements of magic, and at different times in history, it has been more or less integrated and common and woven into Jewish life. There have been times where magic has been practiced by and taught by and like blessed by rabbis, by institutional and rabbinic Judaism, and there have been times when it has been tolerated, and there have been times when it has been prohibited. And what you'll see in some of these texts that we're looking at is that we're not just actually talking about, like, there's rabbinic Judaism, which doesn't have any magic in it, and then there's folk magic, but actually that much of Jewish practice for the past thousands of years has all of these elements of magic in it from the very beginning. And a lot of these practices have been obscured or lost in different points of history, mostly because of anti-Semitism and patriarchy. Because we see, especially in the Middle Ages, that a trope of anti-Semitism is that Jews are magical and practice sorcery in the eyes of Christians, that a lot of Jews began hiding or like letting go of practices that could be construed as magical, even if they weren't magical practices, even if they were just customs. Like, there's this question of sort of what's the difference between magic and religion anyway, right? So for example, like a European Jewish custom of, after leaving a cemetery, of tossing a clump of dirt from the grave behind you as you walk away, right? Like that could be seen as like a religious practice. It could be seen as a superstition, but Jews basically stopped practicing that in front of Christians, because Christians, it was like written about that like Jews were practicing witchcraft, right? So this huge fear of being seen as sorcerers, right? And then on top of that, like especially for people who are femme or don't have access to institutional power, if any of those people are practicing any kind of thing that could be construed as magic, it's like extra dangerous, right? And at the same time, while more women and femme people were being accused of witchcraft and sorcery, the rabbis were also learning from and practicing a lot of these traditions alongside, like learning from, there's this incredible story in the Talmud where a rabbi goes to a village healer, a Jewish village healer, to learn about and do like a demon extract from a person. And they both have their own incantations and practices. So there is a way that there was some integration in it too. But so you have this combination, this like fatal combination of anti-Semitism and patriarchy, and many of these traditions were obscured or lost. And, you know, depending upon each of our families' immigration story, more or less kind of like got assimilated into like loss. So what we have left are like, we have these little like dream fragments, right? We have texts that can help us find the way. We have these little breadcrumbs. We have threads and like literal fragments of pottery and amulets that we find. And so by kind of like doing this magical archaeology, we can breathe life back into these customs and practices, and really, like, for all the reasons that it's healing and kind of an act of resistance and beautiful and nourishing, these practices can help us now in modern times, like heal in our own ways, heal ancestrally, and help us be more resilient and more resourced for these times that we're in, so that we can show up more for collective healing and liberation. So because this is like a short workshop, I'm not going to go deeply into the historical or geographic context of these practices, but I do want to just give you a little image of what we're talking about and where, and just like have a little ground into the land for a moment. So yes, thank you, Antigone. So we're talking about a people who are both, the words that are used to describe like Jewish people for the past thousands of years are diasporic, but also a multi-rooted people with roots in many lands. So you can see in this map, sort of, we're gonna talk about different time periods of people in the Swana region, the Swana and MENA region, Southwest Asia, North Africa, also known as the Middle East, in Syria, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Greece, up into the Balkans and into Europe. So, and we're talking about, and also down, so in the Jewish diaspora, people moving into North Africa, into Algeria and Morocco especially, and also into Spain and Portugal, into the islands and the lands of the Mediterranean, Greece and Italy, up into the Balkans, and then up north into Western and Eastern Europe. The time period we're talking about, we're going to look at practices from the 2nd and 3rd centuries through what we call late antiquity, through medieval times, into the 19th century. And there's a little, for me, it's like really helpful to kind of understand all these historical terms of the whens. And in your handout, there's also like a glossary of sort of like, what are these time periods and where were people? And the last thing I want to say as sort of a frame is just that I want to distinguish between the word protection versus safety, and that I really am deliberate in the use of the word protection. The protection being kind of like an embodied state of our own boundaries, of our own sense of personal space, as like an internal state of being. And just acknowledging that safety is relative, and safety is not something we can always control. And safety is really dependent on the intersections of our identities and how we experience living in a society with so much systemic oppression, and that we can't necessarily control or change how safe we are. And that, these protection practices aren't about making sure nothing bad happens, which isn't possible. Like, Jews couldn't use salt or garlic to prevent the Cossacks, or, to prevent genocide. And in that same way, we can't solely rely on spells and candle work to dismantle white supremacy and the prison industrial complex, right? It's not possible. But we can collaborate with what is invisible. We can deepen into these practices to kind of bolster ourselves and connect with an invisible web of support, so that we can do all the kinds of things necessary for healing work. So we're really just talking about an embodied state, which in my experience can really help us soften and be open to more intuition when we feel held in a container that's made up of not just us. So I want to talk a little bit about, if we're going to talk about protection magic, it's important to kind of get a sense of what have we been protecting ourselves from. Like, it's good to know what we're protecting ourselves from. So for the past thousands of years, there's been sort of two main narratives that Jews have woven about and like organized their protection magic around. One is kind of like evil or malevolent or bad or mischievous spirits, mostly known as shadim. Shadim is the plural, shade is singular. It's often translated as demons. And then the evil eye. So we're going to talk a little bit about those two things. Antigone, you can go to the next slide. So these delightful creatures are drawings of shadim, of different demons. And amazingly, these are actually drawings from between like the 2nd and 5th century. I find them really endearing, even though that is not how I know our ancestors felt about them. If you want to, you're welcome to just like write in the chat things that you're noticing about these shadim. Shadim is Sheydym in kind of like English. They are very cute. Yes. They are similar to jinn. Yes. So something that's important to know is like, as we're looking at what was going on geographically, we know that because Jews were diasporic and were in many different lands that were not necessarily their ancestral homelands, that there's a lot of cultural sharing, both about stories about like malevolent spirits and also about remedies for protection. They're smiling. There's lots of lines, the chains, smiles and genitals. Yeah. One thing to notice about them too is like looking at their feet. Some of them look like humans mixed with other beings. Yeah, claws. So shadim are mentioned in most of Jewish central texts, in the Torah, in the Talmud, in the Kabbalah. And in the Babylonian Talmud, especially it's like full of discussions about how to deal with demons. Okay, can't get over the cuteness. I know, right? The one on the top right literally looks like a self-portrait that my 5-year-old drew of himself. So basically, we know from looking at our central texts that for the most part, the rabbis, the people who were sort of weaving the stories, like weaving our understanding about the world, believed in the existence of demons, of shadim. And with the exception of a few rationalists who then happened to have huge influence over mainstream Judaism, with the exception of the rationalists, this was like mainstream Judaism for thousands of years talked about demons and shadim. So what do we need to know about them? So shadim range from benevolent. Some of them actually are considered helpful and benevolent. Some of them are mischievous and annoying, and some of them are destructive. There's a specific kind of demons called mazikin, which has the root to damage, which are known as sort of like the harmers that are the most destructive shadim. What we know from both pictures and descriptions in the text is that some are winged. There's belief that some of them have chicken feet, that they're usually invisible. There's this really incredible text in the Talmud that talks about if you want to know if there's any demons in your house, at night before you go to sleep, you spread ashes out on your floor. And if you wake up in the morning and there are chicken footprints, then you know that there are demons traipsing around your house. They're thought to live in houses, in the wilderness. Some live near graves and hang out around graves. Some like hang out around people. Some possess people. There's a lot of texts that talk about sort of that they are not unlike humans, that they sleep, that they eat, that they procreate, that they can learn Torah, that they're not immortal. There's a lot of demons that have names, famous demons. So the one on the top left is Lilith, who we'll see a little bit more of. In Kabbalah, they're conceptualized as being actually part of the material world, and because there's the belief that everything in existence was created by the divine. Everything is a creation of the divine, including shadim, right? So these are a creation of the divine, and maybe were created on the 6th day at twilight. Some of them come from the netherworld, and some are actually just undead spirits that may have died traumatic deaths that are sort of stuck in between. And so demons, in a lot of the texts, demons are what are thought of as responsible for most terrible things, like various diseases, headaches, nightmares. You can go to the next slide, Antigone. So I'm going to read this piece. So this is from the Talmud, which is, the Talmud is a sacred Jewish text compiled somewhere between the 2nd and 5th century. So this is from this Rabbi Abai, who I love. His mother was definitely a witch. I would love, he's brings a lot of wisdom into the Talmud. So he says, they, meaning the demons, the Shadim, are more numerous than we are, and they stand over us like mounds of earth surrounding a pit. Rav Huna said, each and every one of us has 1,000 demons to his left and 10,000 to his right. Summarizing the effects of the demons, Rava says, the crowning at the Kala is from the demons. Those knees that are fatigued, even though one did not exert himself, is from the demons. Those clothes of the sages that wear out, despite the fact that they do not engage in physical labor, is from friction with the demons. Those feet that are in pain is from the demons. So basically, anything bad is from the demons, except for what's from the evil eye, which we'll get to. So even worn out clothes, your bunion is from the demons, exactly, the demons. And there's different demons who cause these different things, okay? So on the right, what you see is, this is an incantation bowl. So incantation bowls are specific segulas. Segula, we'll talk a little bit about. Segula is like a magical practice for protection. So this is basically kind of like an amulet against demons. They're mostly thought of as being made between the 5th and 6th century. They've been found archaeologically in what was Mesopotamia and Babylonia. Found throughout like what is modern day Iran, Iraq, and some in Palestine. Most of them were made while these lands where the Jews were under the rule of the Roman Empire. They're made specifically by specific craftspeople who worked with making incantation bowls. And each bowl has a specific incantation. So you would go to an incantation bowl maker, talk about what was going on for you, and the incantation bowl maker would put your name in it with an incantation for what it was for, and often a depiction of the demon, a specific demon, or just kind of general demons. They're like around the size of a cereal bowl, and archaeologists have found them mostly buried, sometimes at the entrance to a house or at the four corners of a house, buried upside down. And some people think it's because it was like buried upside down to kind of trap demons, like if demons came up from the earth. There's lots of ideas about why, and we don't have a lot of information about why. But we know that these bowls are distinctly Jewish because they're usually written almost always in Aramaic, which was the language of the Jews at this time. But there's also, some have Hebrew text, have scripture. So they may talk about a local rabbi and the power of a local rabbi. They have the Hebrew names of the person who made it and the person it's for. And so like this was one practice to help with demons. I put a couple in the handout. There's a couple of articles to read more about incantation bowls, as well as a link to someone who is making incantation bowls and selling them on Etsy now. And obviously you could make one of these yourself and bury them around your house. So let's see. That's a little bit about, we could do a whole class on incantation bowls. They're so incredible. But we're gonna move on to talk about the Ain Hara, the evil eye. This is an incantation bowl specifically binding Lilith. So Lilith was a demon who, or is a demon, depending on how you think of it, who preyed specifically upon pregnant people and newborn babies and children. Lilith in the text is technically Adam's first wife, who gets kicked out for being, haughty and rebellious and empowered. And so she haunts people. And so there's a lot of amulets specifically for Lilith, and they're shown as being kind of bound or chained. So that is Lilith in an incantation bowl. All right, you can go to the next slide. Oh, someone wrote, I assume my cats would know when demons are around. Yes, and actually there's a text, I think, in your handout that talks about there's a way also to conjure. Sometimes people would conjure spirits, and there's a whole recipe for using cat feces. It's really intense. So yeah, there's been a lot of connection with cats and demons. Okay, the evil eye. So even talking about demons and the evil eye, in Jewish tradition, like you need plenty of protection just talking about it. So we have here the eyes of protection on either side. And yes, so the evil eye is present in most cultures around where the Jews have lived, right? Like there's a huge population of Jews in Greece, in the Balkans, and in the Swana MENA regions. So there's a lot of cultural sharing about practices and conceptions of the evil eye. So you have the evil eye in a few different languages here. In the top is Hebrew, Ein Hara, Mal Ojo in Spanish, Ojo Qui in Ladino, which is the language spoken by Sephardic Jews, and Ein Hora in Yiddish, and Malocchio in Italian. Yes, so many people from so many different traditions will talk about, like, this is very, very, like, this has this beautiful web of connections in so many of our cultures. And you'll see a lot of the remedies too that are a connection. So exactly, yes, the correlation between evil eyes being seen as blue, we're going to talk about basically, I think, because of the genetic prevalence of brown eyes in the regions where these traditions are from, mostly in the Fertile Crescent and in the Mediterranean. Blue eyes were very uncommon, and so people with blue eyes were specifically thought of as being actually the projectors of the evil eye, and the way to protect oneself from them was to have a blue eye, like a image of a blue eye. So this tradition about the evil eye has really survived. It is very, very resilient, and it's something that, like, most people still know things about and talk about, grandparents and parents. And the way the evil eye is usually caused by coveting. So basically it can be received or given by coveting something, by jealousy, speaking ill of someone. You're more prone to the evil eye if you're in a state of kind of like insecurity and sunken inness. It can be caused by too many compliments, praise, bragging, and boasting, just by staring at someone, and often, as I was saying, by blue eyes. In ancient texts, in the Talmud, it's talked about that the evil eye is the cause of Sarah looking at Hagar and causing Hagar's miscarriage. That Leah, like in the foremothers in the Torah, that Leah's infertility was caused by the evil eye because she was bragging. And some people even talk about that the breaking of the first tablets was caused by the evil eye. You can go to the next slide, Antigone. So this is from the Talmud. It says, Rav went up to a cemetery and performed certain Kabbalistic things. They don't talk about a lot of the things that they do because they were sort of secret practices. And then said 99% have died through an evil eye and 1% through natural causes. So basically this idea that, like, I feel like somebody needs to make a song, like 99 Problems, an Evil Eye, or all of them or something. Anyway, I can't tell if anyone else is laughing at my joke. Okay, good, somebody. But that's what I think of every time I see this text. So basically most illness and death is caused by the evil eye, that this is the cause for most things. And then there's 1% that's just natural causes that we don't know. It was thought of that the evil eye had this sort of like burning energy, like it was of the element of fire. And so when someone looked at you, you could feel like the fire. And there were lots of remedies to both protect yourself from it and remove it. I found this really wonderful ad from a Jewish newspaper from New York in 2006 that's in the classified section. So I just to kind of bring us into the present, from someone who says, I'm just going to read it in what I know is to be my grandmother's voice. Excellent remedies for healing in marriage and for income and success. Remedies for the evil eye, from exorcisms to lead spilling against the evil eye, for fear, tension, and nervousness, and various problems. It helps and makes life easier, God willing. It is done by an ultra-Orthodox Jew, confidential, for an appointment call, phone number. So this is something that is still practiced. You know, in 2006, we have people advertising different remedies for the evil eye. Oh yeah, you can go to the next slide. This is just like a little, so this is, we're looking into, 19th century Russia. So all the different regions where the evil eye has traveled with Jews. Mariam Puller's prescribed bobas refuas, or grandmother's remedies. One such remedy to prevent colds was placing a piece of garlic in a bag and hanging it around the neck. To drive away an evil eye from a child who suddenly became sick, it was advised to talk against the evil eye. When looking at a beautiful infant, it was advisable to spit and say, "What an ugly baby." So this is from this amazing kind of like anthropological study of this person, Ansky, who went through the Pale of Settlement and recorded lots of information from Jews in the Pale of Settlement, which is sort of like Russian territory. And this actually helped me really understand, I think, what, wow, amazing, CJ. Wow, that's incredible. So this put into context some of the ways that I experienced my own grandparents and great-grandparents and the ways in which they were sort of withholding of praise, right? And kind of like harsh and intense. Just that this was a tradition that too much praise on someone and actually insulting someone was protective of the evil eye. So it's sort of like, for me, is like some historical grounding into a kind of cultural expressions. So we have, Greeks all day, right? Like, just like harsh grandmas. So these are sort of the two things that Jewish protection magic is organized around: shadim and harmful energies, and the evil eye. And we know that being human is really vulnerable and really scary, and there's so much loss and devastation that we cannot understand or control. And in the face of so much unknown, these are the stories that Jews have told about these, like, these are the narratives. That there are spirits, which range from mischievous to malevolent, who interfere in our lives and cause all sorts of destruction and terrible things, that can possess people, and when they possess people, causes them to do terrible things. And that the way we look at each other, the way that we treat each other, has a significant impact on our spirits and on our bodies. That we can affect each other energetically, right? That's what we can kind of get from the sort of storytelling about these two things. Yes, I'm really, CJ, I'm very excited to hear about this book. Oh, great. CJ has put it in the chat. CJ's grandfather was with Ansky. That's really beautiful. Is the evil eye considered Mizrahi? Is Ashkenazi, or both? Everything. It's like throughout Jewish practice, it is like woven throughout all threads of Jews. So Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi. And it's just different, it's languaged differently. Okay, so we know what we are protecting ourselves from. How have we been protecting ourselves? So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so as I've been doing, like kind of diving into all this research, I've sort of begun to understand these mechanisms of protection in categories. We have sort of ways in which we create and shore up our boundaries through practices that usually involve circles, amulets, using swords and metal. We have practices that kind of reflect back. So like the evil eye, or using mirrors, or even this practice of, after a person has been sick, of changing their name. and changing their name and adding the name Chaya or Chayim, which means life. And that's sort of a way of sort of like hiding from the evil eye, right? That the evil eye can't find you if you've changed your name. Practices of saturation and presence, so sort of being so filled with oneself or with like goodness that nothing else can get in. So practices with plants, of practices with water and spit, sort of like focusing on our own selves rather than focusing on what is threatening or scary to us as sort of a way to be protected. Practices of blessings and gratitude. So specifically, this is a very Sephardic custom of like brachot, of blessings, being a protective mechanism, as well as mitzvot, which is a practice of righteous actions, like often translated as sort of like a trite good deeds, like doing good deeds, like reparation work or being kind or keeping Shabbat, like that. Doing these deeds that we are taught to do is a way of keeping these evil spirits and the evil eye away. And then finally, practices of connection and prayer. So practices of prayer and psalms, sacred letters, and words as protection. So those are sort of like the ways that I understand that we protect ourselves. And we're going to talk a little bit about some, we're going to go deeper into some of them. So you can go to the next slide. So the word segulas is often used. In Yiddish, it's zegula. And in Hebrew and also Sephardic and Mizrahi people just call it segulas. Segula means treasure. Or like a treasured thing in Hebrew, but it's the word that's used as sort of like the remedy or the spell or the incantation or the practice, the healing practice. So these are sort of like the main Jewish protection allies or segulas, amulets, incantation bowls, which we looked at, the chamsa specifically as an amulet, the mezuzah, letters and words, metal, circles, the colors red and blue, dirt, ash, and stones, eyes, water, spit, salt, specific plants, which we'll talk about some of these specific plants, sweetening rituals, which is a big practice in Sephardic, mostly Sephardic and Mizrahi practices, tradition, prayers and psalms, incantations, and then ritual cleansings for removing. Which we won't get into as much. So I want to go deeper with a few of these and focus on some of these segulas. And I really wanted to focus on things that we can practice ourselves now. So we'll get to know the history of them, kind of get to know the roots of them. And then there are things that you really can integrate and incorporate into your practices. Okay, so you can go to the next slide. Okay, so these amulets in this picture are dated to, they either were found in the 19th century or some of them were made in the 19th century. It's hard to know sometimes when we look at them, but we think that these are probably from sometime in the 17 or 1800s, mostly from Iran and also from Jerusalem. So the Hebrew word for amulets is kamea, which is from the root. The way that Hebrew works is that it's always connected to some root letters, which has a meaning. And the root of this means to tie or to bind. So that amulets, there's sort of a few different ideas of why that means, like either it's the actual action of tying and binding that is part of the protective practice, but also that it was tied or bind, like it was something that you hung, either on yourself or in your house. And there are traditions of amulets from ancient early Judaism through the Renaissance into the 19th and 20th century and now. And basically, it was just a general belief that they're in the power of amulets as a practical solution for spiritual problems and physical illnesses. And the use of amulets was a really important component of Jewish vernacular practice. Usually they were tied around the neck or around the wrist as a form of protection. And most amulets have a mix of images, text, and letters. You can go to the next slide. So part of the way that we know that there are ancient practices with amulets is not just from archaeology, but in the Talmud. There's a lot of discussion about amulets, like which amulets you should use for what, and specifically this question, which is not, is it okay to have amulets, but is it okay to carry an amulet on Shabbat? Because on Shabbat, one of the prohibitions is carrying things unless it's a sacred object. So it says the sages taught, what is an effective amulet? Oh, what I was going to say is that it is allowed, it is permissible to carry amulets on Shabbat as long as it is an effective amulet. So this is a conversation that rabbis are having about what does that mean, right? This is what I'm saying, why there's like questions and like major debate and conversations like this where people are talking over each other. Collaborative overlap is the term, goes back to ancient Judaism. The sages taught, what is an effective amulet? Any that has healed one person once, healed them again, and then healed them a third time. So it's like needs to go through 3 times. That is the criterion for an effective amulet. And it applies both to a written amulet and to an amulet of herbal roots, both if it has proven effective in healing a sick person who is dangerously ill, and if it has proven effective in healing a sick person who is not dangerously ill. It is permitted to go out with these types of amulets on Shabbat. So this isn't a question of like, were there amulets? Were they practicing magic? But just like, could you carry them on Shabbat? These amulets in this picture were found in an archaeological dig in Tarrega in Spain. These are from the like 1300s. And these were found in a grave of a child. And they would have been strung together for a child to wear around their neck or wrist. And these, you can see, we're going to talk a little bit about the Khamsa next. You can see sort of that there's 2 amulets here that are hand-shaped. There's this bone. They use jet a lot. So there's 2 jet pieces, some coral, and some rock crystal beads. Yeah, and there's lots, like in the Talmud, you know, there's so much text, and there's some in the handout, but I had to kind of just choose a few. But there's like some beautiful text about how many knots you tie in madder root, and there's an amulet recommendation for a child who's missing their father to take the father's shoelace and to tie it around them, and that like children often feel like a kind of sadness in their heart, and there's recommendations for amulets for that. So there's like beautiful remedy recommendations in our sacred texts. Okay, so we're gonna kind of dive into some specific amulets now, and we're gonna talk a little bit about the Khamsa. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so the Khamsa, similar to the evil eye, the Khamsa is woven throughout many traditions and cultures, and because there was so much cultural sharing, especially between Jews and Muslims at different points in history. I'd love to learn about knot tying. Oh, there's actually there's a whole like Jewish, I have like the name of specific Jewish witches who specialized in knot tying. So yes, we can connect about that. So the Khamsa, Khamsa means 5 in Arabic, and there's many names for the Khamsa, right? So in Muslim tradition, it's called the Hand of Fatima, and there's this story of why it's called that. Fatima being one of Muhammad's wives. There are some Jews who call it the Hand of Miriam. Miriam being the great prophetess and liberation worker and organizer of the Jewish people, who was instrumental in liberation of the Jewish people from Mitzrayim. And some people call it just the Khamsa. The Hamsa is thought of having origins in Mesopotamia and Babylonia, like really connected to roots of the symbol of goddesses, of the goddess Ishtar and the goddess Tanit, of kind of like Sumerian goddesses. And they have found, like in archaeology, these like clay hands that people have inserted into the walls of buildings for protection in like Mesopotamian and Babylonian structures. And the Hamsa sort of like then moved its way through both Muslim and Jewish traditions. There's like in the Torah, in the Bible, there's different mentions of a hand, like the hand of the divine as being a protective force. But really when the Hamsa became most popular was in the 15th and 16th century with like the rise of Jewish mysticism or Kabbalah. And the Hamsa is like especially sacred and prominent in Berber culture in North Africa, and in fact is like the symbol. I think it's on the flag of Algeria. So that's a place where like you see a lot of Hamsas like in Berber synagogues and in a lot of Berber jewelry in the Jews in North Africa. This Hamsa in this slide is from the Sefer Harazim, which is, here's something that maybe you didn't learn in Hebrew school. I didn't either. The Sefer Harazim is a Talmudic era text, so sometime between the 2nd and 5th century. It's a magical handbook. And this page is specifically talking about the Hamsa and like how to make Hamsa amulets and wear them and hang them in your house for protection. And you can also see in the right, there's like a square with letters, and that's also like a very significant protective amulet, is these magic squares. Sefer Harazim, yeah, so Sefer means book in Hebrew, S-E-F-E-R, Ha, H-A, Razim, R-A-Z-I-M, the Sefer Harazim. Thank you, Inbal. So you can go to the next slide. So the Hamsa is often like overlaid with other protective symbols. So here we see the Hamsa with the fish. The fish was seen as a protective symbol. It's talked about in the Talmud that fish go underwater and therefore they're immune to the evil eye. So you'll see a lot of fish on Hamsas. And there's a lot of debate. I mean, I've even seen this on Facebook in like Jewish witch circles of people being like, oh, is the fish like the intrusion of like Christian imagery? But actually the fish in the Talmud is considered another amulet, another segula for the evil eye. You see the eye in the middle. The letters in the circle on the top is chai, means chai, which means life. So again, that kind of like protection through life. And the Hamsa also, you can see it has the 5 fingers, and 5 is a sacred number in Judaism. It's connected to the letter He, which you also see in a lot of amulets. And there's lots of reasons why 5 is kind of magic number. Part of it is like there's 5 books of the Torah. There's 5 kinds of offerings or sacrifices one was supposed to do at the temple. So there's a lot of 5s. And then because the Hamsa is sacred with the number 5, then you see a lot of things coming from this. Just using the number 5 is protective too. And there's a beautiful, you can go to the next slide. So here, these are some Hamsas from Morocco from the 20s, from the 1920s. These are kind of like traditional Berber Hamsas with an eye. And this is a quote from Kalina Alves, who was interviewed about traditions. On a new baby, they would put a bracelet with a Hamsa hand with blue beads and a few ujikos. So ujikos is the Sephardic name, the Ladino name for the blue beads with eyes. In Turkish, they're called nazar or nazar donka. And in Ladino, they're called ujikos. They also place a religious book under the pillow to keep the child safe. My mother did it. So just really seeing the way that Hamsas were used along with other kinds of amulets and protective devices, especially for protecting children and pregnant people. The last thing I'll mention is about Hamsas, in the handout, there's a link to a story that kind of came through me about the origin of the Hamsa. That's sort of like a queer retelling of the Miriam story and how her hands became protective. So you can read that some rainy night. Okay, we're gonna move on to talk about the mezuzah. So the mezuzah, this is a mezuzah. It means doorpost in Hebrew. And the mezuzah has its roots in ancient, like kind of even pre-Judaism, when people would place tablets with sacred writing on doorposts for protection, right? It's like nothing new, or nobody's inventing anything by putting protective amulets like at the entrance to your door. But basically these amulets, these mezuzot is plural for mezuzah, they're a piece of parchment called a cloth, which has the inscription of specific Hebrew verses from the Torah and prayers put inside of a case. And then that case is hung in the doorpost. And what basically Jewish law tells us is that anytime we go in or out of our home, that they're supposed to be on every door outside your first door, your front door, but also on all the doors of your house, inside your house, except for the bathroom. You don't need to have a mezuzah going into the bathroom. But even though all space is sacred space, we all know that. And basically the verses inside the mezuzah has the prayer, the Shema, the declaration of oneness, and also the Ve'ahavta, which is like the declaration of love. And it is that verse that tells us you will place these words on the doorposts of your house. And this verse is also part of the bedtime prayer that kind of you say along with the angel prayer that we did at the beginning. The verses are written on the parchment with an indelible ink. They're often written with like a quill or with a reed. And then the parchment is rolled up and placed inside the case. And as you go in and out of the house, you touch the mezuzah and kiss your hand. And it's just so funny because there's like a lot of debate now, again, like lively Jewish debate, like are mezuzot amulets or are they a religious practice, right? And it's like, literally you're putting an amulet on the doorpost that you kiss when you go in and out of your house for protection, but it's not magic. It's just a religious practice. So in ancient times, the mezuzah was absolutely understood as a magical and amuletic practice. There have been sages throughout time who disagreed with that, but for the most part, it was thought of as amuletic. In the Talmud, it's discussed, here's actually, this is from the Zohar. There's a piece that says, now, when the forces of evil, when demons come to the door of a person's house, they raise their eyes, they see the holy name written outside on the mezuzah, namely Shaddai, that's what it says on this one, which has power over all of them. They flee away in fear and they do not come near the door. The Zohar, this is like in the Talmud, in sacred texts, it's talked about that the mezuzah, that evil energies cannot come in your house if you have a mezuzah. It's thought of as connected to also the Passover story, that people would put blood on their doorposts, and that the angel of death, that like a destroying energy, cannot come in. In the Talmud, there's a story of a woman who is possessed by a demon. And one of the things that they do is they come and they put a mezuzah on her door. And once it is installed, she's cured. The demon leaves. Just having the mezuzah on the door makes the demon leave. And then there's also a story that tells that basically when you have a mezuzah on your door, that anytime you leave your house, especially like when you kiss that mezuzah, because what you're doing is interacting with something that has the imprint of the divine in it, that the four angels that we invoked at the beginning, the archangels Michael, Gabriel, Uriel, and Raphael, who all have their energies, that they come with you and they accompany you everywhere. And the mezuzah is also thought of as sort of like a reminder that every house we live in could be the house of the divine, right? That like, whose house is this really? Whose house is this? Is our bodies, that we are all houses of the divine, which I really like to think of when I'm thinking about the mezuzah, that it's not an amulet. Again, it's like not the power of the amulet. It's like the reminder of like the sacredness and holiness that we are and that our homes can be. In the Middle Ages, it was a practice to not just have the prayers, but add the word Shaddai to the back, adding it to the back of the parchment. And also it's often inscribed on the mezuzah. You can see it here. It's Shin, Daled, Yud, going down. That's what that word says. And Shaddai is one of the names. The divine has many, 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 many names. And Shaddai is one of them. And it's kind of like the face of the divine, that's the guardian. The name itself, people translate many ways. My favorite translation of the word Shaddai is mountain or many-breasted one. So it's also sort of like not just a guardian, but like a kind of like the way that Shaddai is talked about in a lot of text is being like these mountains, these like stone mountains, these like mountains, these breasts that are filled with milk and honey. So it also has this sort of like nourishing, protective, parental energy to it. And you'll see Shaddai on many, especially ancient mezuzot. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is an ancient mezuzah in Rhodes in Greece. And you can see it also has Shaddai on it, that circle with the letters Shin, Daled, Yud. Oh, thank you, Jessie Susanna, for putting in stuff about the angels, the 4 angels. So the mezuzah is also thought of, especially in Sephardic culture, as a site for protective rituals, right? And which makes sense because doorways in most, like in magical kind of technology, doorways are seen as like liminal space, right? As a portal from our internal world to the external world. And that like any kind of place that's like a portal like that is also a place of power. So in Sephardic tradition, there's a lot of spells done at the mezuzah. And when something is wrong, and this is true for most Jews now, like if you talk to, especially like Hasidic Jews, like if your business is failing, if someone keeps getting sick, if there was an accident, people will be like, did you check your mezuzah? How's the parchment? Is it kosher? Did it get wet? Is it stained? Are any of the letters messed up? Because that could be a cause, and fixing the mezuzah is seen as the practice to sort of set things right again. And in Sephardic tradition, there's all these different rituals that you practice at the mezuzah. So here is this piece from this woman named Luna Tuvi from Rhodes, who says, I go every morning to the mezuzah as soon as I wash myself. I wash my face and I say, Dias buenos, above all, guardados de hazinura y de horas malas, salud buena, refugio shlema para todos los hazinos, amen. So that's in Ladino, means good days. May we be protected from sickness and bad times. Good health, complete healing. Refugio shlema is Hebrew for total healing. For all who are sick, amen. So I love that, like, especially for people who maybe, especially for, people without institutional power, throughout time, women, especially women and femmes not going to the synagogue, that there was a place in the home, like an altar, where they would go to do their prayers. And that place was the doorway. That place was the mezuzah. And that's like a place that's like a grounding place for prayers and protection, and sort of like grounding in the blessings, right? Grounding in the blessings that are here. There's also traditions, Sephardic traditions of doing these like ritual practices, one called azukar a la mezuzah or kave a la mezuzah, sugar at the mezuzah or coffee at the mezuzah, where you like make little packets at the mezuzah, where you take sugar and put them into little packets that then you do these special kind of rituals throughout the day that are particularly protective or for kind of like removing evil eye. And finally, there's like a more recent custom, like into the 19th century, especially through more and more immigration and displacement of people carrying mezuzot on them, on their bodies. There's all these stories that you can find, like these recordings of people who give their children mezuzot going into like World War I and World War II. Yes. Ladino is very similar to Spanish. It's the language of the Sephardic Jews who were mostly spent many hundreds of years in the Iberian Peninsula, and then also in the Balkans and went other places too, and in North Africa. So this idea of the mezuzah also as a personal amulet. And I found a text that, from a Hasidic rabbi who recommended for someone who is having recurrent nightmares to place the mezuzah by their bed for nightmares. Okay. And then, you know, you can go to the next slide. I'll say a few little things, just that I think of these amulets like that there's a lot of significance and power of the words of the word, right? Judaism, like it's a core Jewish belief that the world was created through word, through letters, and that there's a lot of letter reference and reverence of words and letters. And so in a lot of amulets you see, not just in the mezuzah, which is like a written prayer inside of an amulet, but also amulets that people carried often were just a writing of like, this is what I want to happen, this is an incantation, rolled up and carried in some kind of container. And we could go so deep into the specific letters and phrases and words, but I'm not gonna go into that right now. But there's also a tradition of like the actual books, sacred books themselves, being an amulet. So putting those under the pillow or carrying them with you if you're going to the hospital, that like letters, words, and books are incredibly potent. So here you have an amulet on the left is from Iraq. It's just like an amulet holder. And on the right, this one is from Morocco. And you can see there's like a tooth and there's an acorn and then the text all rolled up into this little leather pouch. You can go to the next slide. Just some more amulets on the left. The Shaddai and the Hay on that little amulet on the left. On the top right is a book from Turkey with magical incantations from the 20th century. And then on the bottom right is an amulet written by the Holy Ari, who's like a famous rabbi from the 16th century in the Ukraine. This is specifically an amulet against plague. So, and you can see that most of these are integrating letters and words as part of the magic. And then the next slide. On the left, this is an amulet from Podolia, from the Ukraine, a place called Podolia, now called the Ukraine. This is from the early 20th century, and it basically is just stating, Lilith, stay away from this baby. And then you can see on the bottom, it says Shaddai, Shaddai on both sides of the star. The use of the name of the divine a lot as keeping bad energies away. And then on the right, this is an amulet from Iraq from the early 1900s with the names of angels on it. So just like the invocation of angels and divine words and names as protection. Okay. All right, we're going to go to another amulet, beloved amulet. This is a very dear to my heart amulet called Busikas, which is a Sephardic amulet that's basically just a bag with stuff in it, which is like, I'm sure that this is like a tradition that is throughout many, many cultures for healing. It's just like, sew yourself a little bag and stick your stuff in it. So this is a Sephardic woman saying, at times, the protective objects could be tied together in a little sack. One woman recalled some time ago, they carried a bolsica, which is Ladino for little sack, like bolsa in Spanish, with some salt, garlic, and a blue bead. Another remembers that with some cloves and garlic, they would put it in a little piece of cloth and sew it to the top of the shirt against the evil eye. So these are some of the things that are often in a bolsica: garlic, rue, cloves, salt, blue beads or eye beads, those and often with red string or fabric, sometimes with blue. and most of the time people would wear them, but it could also just be any piece of cloth sewn up. This is a fancy one on the left, but most times it would just be a piece of cloth sewn up with the stuff in it. And the idea, like most of the, like using garlic and rue in clothes, what we're going to talk about is this, that like the way that Sephardic Jews have thought about the power of these things is really that the scent itself was really protective, that the scent was part of the power, like the pungent odors, and that it repels evil spirits. Okay, so we're going to talk about garlic a little bit. Go to the next slide. Okay, so garlic, ajo ajo in Ladino, shum in Hebrew, and thum. I don't speak Arabic, but I'm sorry if I'm not saying that word right. But what I've heard from friends who've tried to coach me is something like thum. So garlic, I hold garlic as sort of like a heart of Jewish healing and plant medicine. Oh, thank you, Inbal. So from early ancient Judaism, in like the building of pyramids in Egypt when Jews were enslaved, Jews talked about eating garlic to keep themselves strong. And Jews referred to themselves as garlic eaters. That was like a nickname that Jews had for ourselves. And then, of course, that name also was used as a pejorative name in the Roman Empire. The Romans would talk about Jews as garlic eaters and talk about how they stank and talk about their smell. And that continued in Spain during the Inquisition, that the inquisitors would actually go out and follow the scent of garlic cooking. And that was actually like a punishable offense to be cooking garlic, because it usually meant it was connected to being Jewish. And so they would smell garlic cooking and they would go to the houses where they smelled garlic cooking, and you could be punished, killed for being Jewish, but the way that they would find you was through the garlic, right? So it has this sort of like amazing kind of meaning as both this sort of like we have been identified ourselves as garlic eaters, and garlic has been protective and healing for us, but also it has been a way of marking us and as a source of pain and genocide. So garlic is, I think, particularly powerful for Jews because it is a plant that lends itself to diaspora, right? Like it embodies diaspora. It can pass imaginary borders drawn by empire, and it can be carried by generations of people and exponential growth. Like one clove becomes another head, that can be divided up into other cloves. It grows and grows and grows. And similar to Jews, garlic was grown first in the Fertile Crescent and then wove its way through the diaspora with Jews throughout Europe, throughout the Fertile Crescent, and into the US. There's a food historian in Gil Marks who talks about garlic as like the unifying factor in kind of all expressions of Judaism, that it is like the one flavor that is in Sephardic, Mizrahi, and Ashkenazi Judaism, in Jewish food. So throughout thousands of years of diaspora and exile, garlic has always been with us. You see here in the Talmud, garlic is thought of as being like an incredible medicine. Garlic satisfies hunger, keeps the body warm, makes the face bright, increases a person's potency, and kills parasites in the bowels. And garlic was also thought of as like a specific delight, like you were supposed to eat garlic on Shabbat. You can go to the next slide. So garlic was used a lot for the evil eye. There's a saying, al ajo que se le vaya, let it go to the garlic, like let the evil eye go to the garlic. And it was used, hung on doors, hung on windows. My great grandma kept it in her bag and sometimes like tucked it in her bra. I love this saying from this person. Garlic is for evil eye. Ruda is for evil eye. That's rue. They would put a piece of it in the clothing and hang it in the house. For espanto, fright. Doctors don't know anything about fright. He is going to give you all the medicine in the world. Nothing to it. It won't work. So basically, this woman's like, they don't know what they're doing. You have fright. You need garlic and rue. You can go to the next slide. So lots of practices with garlic. Tied between the breasts for somebody who just had a baby, placed in the ear. My great grandmother and my mother put garlic in my ear when I was sick, used in bolsicas, and you know, this incredible power. Okay. Rue, we'll talk quickly about rue. So rue also was cultivated by Jews in ancient Israel. Is grown, it's wild in Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, southern Sinai, and also native to the Balkans. Oh, we go back to rue for a minute on the slides. Rue is a good medicine for keeping away plague and parasites. And among the Sephardim, rue is called La Reina de las Hierbas, the queen of all herbs, because of its power. And this is from this song that was supposed to be sung on Tu B'Shvat, which is the New Year of the Trees. And this is sort of the song that rue sings. Great is my fame, I am the rose of newly delivered mothers. They place me on their beds, and all the evil eye I consume with my plants. I guard the soul of the one who wears me. So rue is considered really like especially powerful for people who just had babies, and is pinned, like put on the head of the person who just had the baby, pinned to newborn baby's clothes. Some people say they pinned it on for like a full year until the baby turned a year old. It was covered in gold and then placed on an almond with some sugar for someone who just had a baby. And it was also used, it's also been used for Sephardic evil eye removal, putting it in a bowl of water and then doing this kind of like lead pouring ritual to remove the evil eye from someone. And then that bowl is thrown out into the street. So there's a lot of use of rue for the evil eye. We're gonna go to the next slide. It was also used in Lithuania as a snake charm for protection from snakes. Okay, cloves. I was going to say a quick little thing about cloves. Cloves, claves in Ladino, tsiporin in Hebrew, and I don't know how to pronounce it in Arabic, but if someone wants to write that in the chat, I'd be so grateful. So again, something that's very, very protective with a strong scent. This is a picture of a baby in Turkey, a Jewish baby with a string of cloves around it as protection. So cloves are used similarly, like in a bolsica, in a string of a necklace, but also used in a ritual called claves a la lumbre in Sephardic tradition, which is basically this tradition where you take handfuls of cloves and you, Arneflarn, Carnifla, looks like Carnifla, okay. Yeah, it was something, somebody was telling me it was something like Arneflarn. You take the cloves and you kind of like do like a rubbing all over your body, around your body, and then throw the cloves into fire and watch the cloves pop. And when they pop, that's like the evil eye is dispersed. So there's this beautiful clove ritual. And then some people would do a thing where they would burn some cloves, take the ashes, put it into water, and then drink this kind of like burned clove tea. Okay, you can go to the next slide. I'm going to just say a few words about salt, and then we're going to close. Oh, so I'm so happy to be talking about this, and I never want to stop. So salt. So in ancient times, like in the Torah, we kind of get the idea that when babies are first born, that they are rubbed in salt and wrapped in salt. And yes, your love for salt is super ancestral. So it's like really seen as a protection and as like a softening. And then salt is also seen as one of the main offerings, right? So here, this is from Leviticus, from the Hebrew Bible. You shall season your every offering of your meal with salt. You shall not admit it, your meal offering, the salt of your covenant with God. With all your offerings, you must offer salt. So salt is like really central to offerings, and what is an offering? So in Hebrew, the word is korban, or korbanot, meaning offering, but it's also connected to the word karov. And basically what offerings are known to be is, an offering is like what you give to become closer to the divine. It's a connection. It's making a connection. And so salt is seen as one of these things, and it also is connected to the covenant, right? This promise or this connection. So salt to me is really about protection through connection, through offerings of connection. There's lots of practices in the Talmud of sort of like rubbing your feet with oil and salt to sort of cleanse. salt is seen as like a really powerful preservative, kind of like also preserving our energy. When people, so traditions in Europe, especially in Northern Europe, there's all these traditions of making a circle of salt around somebody in labor. And then these traditions of wearing bread dipped in salt as an amulet. In like ancient Rhineland in Germany, Jews would do a piece of old challah dipped in salt and wear it. And Jews throughout Europe, still there's lots of recordings of placing salt in the corners of the house and in the pockets. And there's a Sephardic tradition of taking salt, throwing it in the toilet, peeing on it, and then saying, as the salt is dissolving, so is the evil eye dissolving. There's like this combination of sort of salt and pee dissolving the evil eye. So salt is also used in bolsikas. And there's a beautiful salt ritual that is done in Sephardic tradition of like going to the ocean and invoking Miriam again, and doing a similar thing of using salt to like kind of rub around you and then throw it in the sea. So again, salt is like this protective and also cleansing and offering remedy. So I just wanted to share a little bit of some of these remedies that like actually you can practice at home, and perhaps you will have a new relationship with a hamsa, with a mezuzah, with some of the things that are engraved in those things, some of the letters, or maybe you'll make yourself a little bolsika this week, as we all probably need more protection, or make it for someone you love. I'm happy to answer questions in the last few minutes that I have, but before we close, I just want to say a little protective blessing and prayer for all of us and for all of our beloveds and for everyone who is especially vulnerable at this time, that we all be held in a circle of rue and garlic, that we be encircled by salt and cloves, that we be surrounded by blessings and love, that our comings and going be blessed, and that we be so fully saturated in our own presence that we are so full that we can feel and sense divine presence around us and in us all the time. So thank you all so much for being here and showing up, and for your beautiful questions, which I can't wait to read now and later. And I'll try to answer some little questions, and feel free to reach out to me. I'm slow at emailing back, but I will always email back. And so feel free to reach out to me and email me, dorimidnight@gmail.com, if you have other questions. And I am planning on doing like a whole series on Jewish protection magic where we go deeper into each of these things. So you can stay tuned for that. And so I don't know if it's 4:30 where I live. So I don't know if we have any cushion of like a couple minutes for one question, or we can just close. Whatever moderators say is the best thing to do to honor.
We have probably literally just a couple minutes of flexibility. So I'm gonna just pull, one question was, is there a specific place you recommend putting a hamsa in your house?
That's a great question. You know, for a lot of these things, I really feel like use your intuition, like you kind of know where to put it, right? It can go anywhere and everywhere. But for me, I really like doorways, like hanging it over or around doorways, over your bed, over your altar, places where you feel like particularly like it would feel really good to have the reminder of that kind of protection. There's the tradition that when the hand is up like this, that it's protective, and when it's down like this, that it's sort of offering healing. But I really think, like in the same way that with tarot cards, you can kind of read it both ways. It's like that the hand is holding both of those things all the time.
And one other quickie was, what are your thoughts on ingesting rue?
Oh, yeah. So people definitely ingest rue. It's like I think anybody from kind of Swana traditions know, like rue is used as a seasoning and used culinarily. And it is an abortifacient. It can cause contractions, and it's also cause photosensitivity, meaning if you kind of like, I did a workshop where someone was like really falling in love with rue, and I brought like a live rue plant, and the person was like, oh my gosh, I'm really feeling this rue, and like rubbed it all over and then got a rash, because it's like you go out in the sun, it's intense. It's an intense plant. So I would say like go slow, take it slow with a rue, and do some research online about, for you, like it is ingested in small amounts, and like talk to people who have a lot of experience with cooking with and ingesting rue. But definitely it's ingested in a lot of these traditions, and still in Swana tradition.
Great. We can do one more question if you want, Jessie Susanna.
Okay. What do you think about non-Jewish practitioners working with Lilith?
That's a big question. And I think in general, like there's a lot of questions of sort of like, what is open tradition and what is closed tradition? I think, to me, I think working with demons in general is intense magic and big magic, and should be approached with a lot of intention and thought. And I can only answer for myself. I think like probably asking, there's Jewish, a bunch of like Jewish witchy Facebook groups. And I think if you're really interested, to sort of check in with more collective of people of like, how do people feel about working with Jewish traditions if you're not Jewish? And depending upon who your people are too, I think that matters in terms of power and access to culture, and like what it feels like cultural appropriation or not. Like I think there's a way that cultural sharing, it does matter, right? Where we're coming from in those things, and how we approach them in a respectful way. So that's always a tricky question, and a really good and important question.
I thought when you said that, if you would like 5,000 opinions on that question, you should take it to the Jewish Witch Facebook group.
That is true.
Amazing. That is so true.
People who are like, yes, and definitely people who are like, I will kill you if you do that. So
there are a lot of opinions.
There are a lot of opinions.
Why not? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dori.
Thank you so much, Dori. It always blows my mind to see just how, like, we're the same people, like the Greeks and the Jews. I'm just like, okay, we're just the same people. So thank you so much for your wisdom. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Jessie Susanna. And we'll see you all in the next one.
Thank you so much. Blessings.